Okay. All right. So this is my second lecture to this group. We spoke again on Hanukkah. My name is known as Rabbi Chaim Cohen, Rabbi Kenny Cohen, and Achihud gave me the opportunity to speak about a subject which doesn't get spoken about a lot. And basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to analyze the origins of the divide within the Orthodox community between religious Zionism and the Hareidi, what we're known as the ultra-Orthodox community. Where did it begin? How did it happen? And what can be done about it? That's the main subject that we're dealing with, that I'm going to deal with today. I want to begin by just telling you that something which I guess this is something which is pretty much common knowledge, and that is history is very biased. You can read history books on a lot of subjects, and you wouldn't believe that you're necessarily talking about the same event, because the way that it's covered from a person's own bias has a big effect on how the events are being portrayed. So I'm not denying that this is my personal take on what's happened over the last 120 something years, and this is completely. I know that what I'm going to say could be challenged, and I'm not so concerned about the accuracy of the historical events, but more significant is what they represented. So when we speak about Zionism, even though that's obviously a major part of the Torah, because today is election day in Israel, and it used to be one of the campaigns, which I assume that most of us in this group are a part of, would be what we would call religious Zionists, or we're known as Mizrahi. There really isn't the same religious party that always existed, but they always had a motto of Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael. The three aspects of Judaism were the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the Torah of Israel. So that's what makes, so every Jew should be a Zionist. But in different times in history, it became a crazy thing. I even remember when I was going to college in Chicago, that I saw my first demonstration in the early 70s, where there were Palestinian students who were screaming out, Jewish people, yes, Zionism, no. And I was the first time I ever heard that there was such a thing, that they wanted to separate. And people were wearing pins. I think when Arafat went to the United Nations in 1974, people had pins saying, I am a Zionist. And that became a method for people to make a separation. So they would. So I believe it's probably a term that was used in order to create a license to be anti-Semitic. It's saying, oh, I have nothing against the Jewish people. It's those Zionists. But and so it has all kinds of different connotations. But I did check. I wanted to be sure when the Dreyfus trial was. They actually recently made a movie of it, Alfred Dreyfus, and there was anti-Semitism in that trial, and it affected Theodore Herzl very deeply, and it, according to many opinions, it motivated him to organize the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And I do have a good friend who has a collection of letters of Herzl, Theodore Herzl, original letters of Herzl. And he was also a controversial figure, but he wanted to claim that based on a lot of the letters and seeing what his motivation was that he really was a feeling Jew. He may not have been a practicing Jew, but he identified himself very strongly as a Jew. And so he felt that because anti-Semitism was so strong, he needed to push the idea of a Jewish homeland. And I'm always very moved by the story of what took place in that Zionist Congress in 1897, because it's a little known story. You know, we have streets in Israel, probably in every major city, called Max Nordau. Max Nordau was one of the original Zionist sort of founding fathers. He was a physician. His name was Dr. Max Nordau. And there's a story that's told that's not known so well, that at the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he got up to speak, and his little speech that he made caused Herzl to write a letter to him saying to him that the whole Zionist Congress was worth it because of your story. And the story that he told was that he had a patient that morning in his clinic who was a boy with from a cheder, very religious school, probably peyot, and he said he asked the boy, "What did you learn today in cheder?" Very interesting, because if you study Gemara, there are many instances in the Talmud where people would base what to do on asking a child what they had studied. If there was a certain pasuk or certain verse that was learned, and then they would gather some kind of a meaning from that particular verse. So the child said, "We learned today about our mother Rachel, and how our mother Rachel has not stopped crying for her children who have left Israel, and how she's waiting to be able to welcome them back." And he said to the boy, like patted him on the head, he said, "Good boy, good boy." And then he turns to the audience and he says, "We need to come home. We need to, our mother Rachel is calling us." And it was very, very moving, and very, very motivating. And that sort of got the thing going. Now, what I think is important, again, this is my personal bias of the whole affair, is that when the Zionist movement started to get going, it made a lot of religious Jews nervous, because if they look back at history, we were confronted with all kinds of groups that challenged the authenticity of Judaism. You had the Prushim and the Tzedukim, you had the Hellenists and the Hasidim, you had false messiahs like Shabtai Tzvi, you had the Karaites, and they're saying, what are these guys doing? These guys are trying to make a campaign to bring the Jewish people back to their homeland, when most of them don't observe anything. They don't keep kosher, they don't keep Shabbos, they don't keep the mitzvah, they don't wear a kippah, they don't show pride in the observance of the mitzvot. How could anything good come from this? And I think that this is the origin of the divide between what we call today the Hareidi community with the religious Zionist community, because they never let go of that idea. And I believe that idea was justified. I think it really was justified in the beginning, that you do need to be nervous when you see people doing things that seem to be a change to Judaism. Even when the Hasidic movement began with the Baal Shem Tov and his followers, there were many people known as mitnagdim who objected, saying, "What are these guys doing? We need to protest when they're changing the Torah." Now, there were some rabbis that was known, Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher of Cook, who saw that this could be the way that the Geulah, the final redemption, was going to come about by way of secular Jews, because we do have such a concept of the Sitra Achara, the dark side, so to speak, Satan, that tries to prevent good things from happening. And if the Zionist idea was being pushed by secular people, then even Satan, even the dark side, would say the same thing. Like what's going to come out of these guys? These guys don't seem to have that much faith in God. And so they say that was a way to trick Satan, similar to the way Mashiach himself, the origins of Mashiach. You have Ruth, who's a Moaviyah, and she comes from the origin of an incestuous relationship with Lot and his daughter. And you have Tamar and Yehuda. You have all these situations that you figure, how could the Mashiach come from that? So that's the way that religious Zionists, even early on, said, let's wait and see how this thing transpires. What's fascinating is that from 1897 to 1948, there was quite a big jump in the population of Israel. I know that Rav Shmuel Eliyahu has given lectures talking about, and I'm not sure that this was verified, but I believe him, that there were as few as 7,000 Jews in the year 1800, and something like 90,000 people by the end of the 19th century, from what I understand. Not all of those were Jewish. And then by the time the state of Israel began in 1948, there were 600,000 Jews in Israel, which are pretty impressive numbers. So when people are seeing that this is happening, then they have to start to wonder, like what's going on. Jews are able to find a place to live in Israel, but there wasn't yet a Jewish homeland. But what I think is also important is that how this affected American Jewry, because what was going on in the United States from 1897 to 1948, that's when many of our relatives, I know that was true of my own grandparents, that's when they came from the old country to the United States. And many of them were confronted with all kinds of challenges and issues, such as Shabbos. They were poor, they needed to make a living, and many of them had to rationalize this. Even when I moved to Chicago in 1967, I was told that there's a Machal Shabbos minyan on Shabbos. Today we call them Hashkama minyans, but there was a Machal Shabbos minyan for people who had to work. They would daven at 7 in the morning so they can go to work at 9 o'clock, even as late as the 60s. So the question was, what was happening to American Jewry at that time? So it's maybe that, let's say, my grandparents on both sides were observant Jews, and both my parents were born in Chicago, and they remained observant, but most of their families did not. And I don't think this was unusual, because there was so much of a push to try to make ends meet, and there was also just the idea of the new country and not being greened, and so as each generation went on, Judaism kind of limped along. Orthodox Judaism in 1948 in America was pretty weak. I remember a conversation between two Chicagoans. Chicago allegedly had something like 260,000 Jews at I don't remember exactly the year, but they were arguing how many of those were Orthodox, and the number was something like 2,600. Not 10%, but 1%. And it probably was true of every major city, is that there were not that many Orthodox Jews. And again, if my understanding of history is correct, the conservative movement was stronger at that time than the Orthodox movement was. I think there was a motto that said, families that pray together stay together, and it was important to pray without a mechitza, without a division. And this was Orthodoxy didn't have at that point very many day schools. There were certain yeshivot that kept things going on, but they were not that strong. And you didn't have that many kosher restaurants the way that, people need to understand that it wasn't always this way for Jews in America. You were afraid to walk around with a kippah, and you didn't. And I remember even discussions back from when I can remember in the 60s, what it was like to have a proper halachic burial. That wasn't something which was a given. The Jews had to fight for that over the years in various cities until they were able to do things according to halacha. So American Jewry was not, Orthodox Jewry in America was not very strong. I believe that the conservative movement made a horrible mistake in 1953 when they allowed, and it's surprising, most people don't know that it's 67, almost 68 years ago, that they allowed driving to shul on Shabbos. And I think that was sort of like something which really ended up being very devastating to that movement. And people like the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who began day schools and reviving Orthodoxy, things began to change. But the reason why I'm mentioning America, it's not just America, Canada, Europe, where London, Paris, where there were Jewish communities, things changed dramatically because of Israel. But there always was. Now, again, I'm not clear exactly when there was the definition that you were an Orthodox Jew and you were either define yourself as an Aguda or a Mizrahi. If you're a Mizrahi, you were a religious Zionist, and you saw the state of Israel as something which was a positive thing that eventually developed. And if you were a Aguda guy, then you still were kind of wary about the whole thing and wondering whether or not this thing was really going to happen, if it really was part of God's will. To this very day, there are those that challenge the Zionim, the Zionists, and they still don't believe that they're convinced that the Medina, the state, is something which is necessarily going to happen. So that's why there was controversy to this day, whether or not you say the prayer for the Medina, for the state of Israel, the Tfilah L'Shlomo Medina, because in that prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel was the line that Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, bless the state of Israel, Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of our redemption. and many of them didn't like that. And what I find fascinating, and maybe at the end of this lecture, if someone can answer this, because I see among the people that are here, there are some learned, scholarly people, is how do we explain this? And I believe this is fact, that in the 60s and 70s in the United States, you had probably roughly 75% of Orthodox Jews call themselves Mizrahi, and 25% call themselves Aguda. And today it's the reverse. How did that happen? I'm going to give you my explanation of it, but it doesn't really make any sense. Now, I want to tell you a story that I heard from Rabbi Wein, and he describes what happened, again, Chicago, in 1948. May 14th, 1948 was a Friday, and there are a few people here who might even remember that. And it was a Friday, and when the state of Israel was declared, and Rabbi Wein said that on Sunday, May 16th, they made an impromptu celebration for the state of Israel at the Chicago Stadium. So people like basketball, Michael Jordan made the Chicago Stadium famous. He started his career there, and then I think they moved. But Chicago Stadium held 18,000 people, 20,000 people. And Rabbi Wein claims that there were as many people outside as inside. So on May 16th, 1948, you had something like 40,000 people coming to celebrate the establishment of the state of Israel. And obviously, these were not all Orthodox Jews. They were Jews of all backgrounds. He said that the beginning of this rally for the state of Israel, or celebration, all they did was raise the Israeli flag to the rafters. That was how the ceremony began. He said for the next 10 minutes, people couldn't speak. Could you imagine that happening today? For 10 minutes, they couldn't speak because they wept. They wept because many people, this is a few years after the Holocaust, and again, quoting Rabbi Wein said that people would have crawled across Europe in order to get to Israel. And so they had a state, we had a homeland of the Jewish people. And that was an incredible moment. Now, I wonder at that moment, how many of the people who were still questioning whether the state is a good thing, how many of them really weren't feeling that same joy? I think maybe they were forced to keep it to themselves, but it had to have been a great moment. And there were moments like that where the rabbis of the time who saw the greatness of the moment said, I hope that people will not take this for granted. You know when they said that again? They said it again when the Kotel was in our hands, the Western Wall was in our hands in 1967. I believe it was Rav Goren, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, they all had that same reaction. I hope Jews don't take that for granted. So I think that the rules of the game kind of changed when Israel became an entity. And it seems that there was definitely a connection between the Holocaust and the state of Israel. And people appreciated that much more that we now had a Jewish homeland 3 years after the Holocaust. Now, there was a big event, which again, I know it's kind of biased, but this is the way that what I was told for many years. Remember that Aguda Convention of 1952, that in the Aguda Convention of 1952, there was a rabbi by the name of Yitzhak Meir Levin, Itchemeyer they called him, who got up at the Aguda Convention, and of course the Mizrahi people quoted this for years, right? And he stamped his hand on the table and he said, enough objecting to the state. It's a real thing and it's an entity. And maybe if we weren't so stubborn and we would have joined and supported the state, we could have avoided the Holocaust. So that's like a huge statement coming from one of the people who were known as Aguda, or what today would be called ultra-Orthodox Hareidi. Now, the same divide sort of happened in Israel too, where you had major parties. When there would be other elections, all you needed Aguda and Mizrahi And one major party, I'm pretty sure about this, but you could correct me if I'm wrong, that you maybe only 3 parties were needed to form a coalition in the government, and you could form a government of 61 people. So they had a big role in Israel when they were the 2 major religious parties in Israel as well. Okay, so we're now, there's now this awareness from 48 to 67. Judaism was kind of limping along in the United States, and in Israel it was tough. Things were really tough. And then came the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War was an incredible time in history. I was old enough to remember. I was in the 8th grade when it happened, and the Jews were so nervous beforehand that this was, God forbid, going to be an end to the Jewish people, because Nasser was gloating how he's going to drive Israel into the sea. And Israel accomplished in 6 days what took Joshua 7 years to accomplish. And many, many lands in Israel were liberated, Judea and Samaria. Unbelievable time. People used to walk around with a patch on their eye because Moshe Dayan at that time was the hero of the 6-Day War. And there was a Jewish revival, there was a Jewish awakening that it made people proud. On the one hand, what was kind of ironic is that many people felt that the only reason why there was a state of Israel declared is because of the guilt feelings of the nations of the world, and that's why they voted for a Jewish state. And I know I heard it directly from non-Jews that after the 6-Day War, they said, okay, now we could start hating the Jews again. Now we don't have to feel sorry for them because they won a miraculous war. But for Jewish people, I think that had a huge effect on what became the Baal Tshuva movement. From 1967, the Yom Kippur War, some people say the Yom Kippur War was even a greater miracle than the 6-Day War. It certainly didn't have the glory because we lost 2,600 soldiers, which was a huge catastrophe. But Israel became something which was in the spotlight. And for the first time in many, many years, a Jew had to answer the question, why am I not living in Israel? That living in Israel, making Aliyah, became a religious question. When it wasn't available to us, so it was a mitzvah that you can observe. There's a famous Tosfot, which is interesting because the author of that Tosfot was Reb Chaim Cohen, which is my name. And he was trying to make a distinction between what kind of a mitzvah it is to live in Israel. It's a mitzvah to say, it is a positive commandment, but there's a mitzvah to say, which is a mitzvah kiyumi. It's a mitzvah that if you fulfill it, but it's not necessarily a mitzvah ma'asi, that you have to do it, and many people quoted that. But the issue of a religious Jew living in Israel became a major issue because it was now available to us, and it was glamorous to us to be able to have a state of Israel to come home to. And some of my friends that are watching right now can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember a period of time, maybe it was from 67, maybe until 1980-ish, maybe the early 80s, where a religious Jew would not dare say that he has no plans to make Aliyah. I remember this very clearly, so what a lot of people would say was, okay, I'm coming in 2 years. But no one had the chutzpah to say I'm not coming during those years. It didn't last for a long time. But that was the feeling. I remember sitting with a friend of mine at the great synagogue, and we had both made Aliyah. He was actually the president of the shul where I was the rabbi, and we see a guy, and he knew that we had both left Los Angeles to make Aliyah, and so my friends asked him, hey, when are you making Aliyah? And he said, 12 years. And we thought, 12 years, come on, that means you're never going. We used to think when people said 2 years, that meant that they were never going, but they wouldn't dare admit that they have no plans to make Aliyah. So here's the part where there is great, this is my personal opinion, which I completely understand is arguable. Now, interesting that I have watching here, one of the people knew me at the time. It was actually one of my students. He was in the 4th grade when I moved to Los Angeles. So listen to this, because most people didn't confront what I confronted. I left Los Angeles in 1967 after the Six-Day War. And I had a teacher by the name of Adler Zik, who became very famous in the Gush Emunim movement. He went to Los Angeles to learn about how to make movies. And so he taught in our school. And we thought it was the coolest thing in the world that he left our class to go fight in the Six-Day War. Okay, that's how I left Los Angeles. And then I came back to Los Angeles 11 years later as a rabbi, after living in Chicago and doing all my training there. And I couldn't believe how Los Angeles had changed. And that as soon as the first Yom Ha'atzmaut came, they had a program in the school where the rabbis were bashing Israel, talking about the secular Zionists and how they cut the payot of the Yemenite Jews. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the way you celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut? It was the first time that I'd ever been confronted with this attitude, anti-Israel attitude. Now, my opinion is that what was going on is that the two avenues that one could take, living life as an American Jew versus living life as an Israeli Jew, became a very big contrast. Because in Israel, you had to really struggle. In America, things were becoming more and more affluent. And as more and more people were becoming religious, then more and more religious became easier to practice Judaism. You had many, many more kosher products. You had many more kosher restaurants. You had, I remember there was an LA Times article from the 70s where it said, an Orthodox Jew has everything he wants in Los Angeles. That was the article that made it to the LA Times. You have rabbis, you have kosher bakeries, you have proper burials, you have synagogues, you have yeshivot. Everything is wonderful. Now there is a colleague of mine by the name of Rabbi Moshe Kaplan, who also happens to have been the son-in-law of Meir Kahana, a very, very strong Rav Kook man. And he used that article, probably to this day, he uses that same newspaper article as a yearly class that he teaches, saying, what's wrong with this article? Why is this article not correct? Okay, now, is it possible to say that the real religious Zionists made Aliyah and they left behind the ones that didn't have the courage to make Aliyah because it wasn't something which was popular? Or, this is my opinion, is that because it became so hard to live in Israel and people wanted to keep their consciences at ease, then they needed to find rabbis who told them, you don't need to go. And it got worse and worse over the years, where people even had the nerve to say that the Torah, the Torah is just as good in Lakewood and Muncie, and you don't even need the Torah of Eretz Yisrael. And you don't have to go. There isn't an obligation to go. And I think that's the reason what happened is that people didn't want to feel guilty anymore, and that they were able to feel that it's okay. They're just as good observant Jews in Chutz La'aretz, in America, as those that live in Israel, even though they didn't go, because their rabbis told them, you don't have to go. How do you go to the Medina? How do you go to live among Sionim that so much other people don't keep the laws and everything else? And I think that's what happened. And I think that's the reason why you had the switch, the glory and the excitement of the Six-Day War, where it became something like a glamorous, to make your home in Israel. The feeling of chalutziyut, pioneering spirit, was substituted by reality. The reality was, it's tough to live in Israel, and it's a lot easier and it's a lot more comfortable if a person chooses not to live in Israel. But how do you live in Israel? How do you live outside of Israel when every now and then you might open a book and that makes you feel guilty? Or maybe you'll even say Birkat Hamazon, the benching that we say after every meal, because the benching has two blessings in the benching. One is that we thank God for the Aretz HaTovah, the good land that God gave us, and we ask God to rebuild Jerusalem. So when you're saying the grace after meals, are you really saying, thank you, Hashem, because that's what we're doing, thank you, Hashem, for the good land that I don't want to go to? In essence, that's the truth. That is the hard truth that people either they're not aware of what's in the Birkat Hamazon, or they don't pay attention to it. And we can look at all the prayers that we're about to say. We're going to say on Pesach, the Haggadah. Why did God take us out of Egypt? Right? I was watching once Prince of Egypt with little children in America, and I asked the simple question. I said, Moses took the Jewish people out of Egypt to take them where? And they couldn't answer. They went to day school. A simple question. They took us to come to Israel. Because of our sins, we were exiled of the land. That's in the davening, all over the place. So how do you say those words and not feel guilty? You find yourself a rabbi that tells you, you got to be really machmir, be very strict on many laws, walk the walk, talk the talk, and act from and be from and everything else. And then this Israel thing will go away. That's my opinion. Most people never will talk about it. Most people then maybe even never thought about it. But this was thanks to the Gulf Manor Synagogue. It gave me a platform, which maybe might be the last platform, to speak to them, to share with you what I believe to be this truth. And I hope that many people will watch this on YouTube and will be exposed to it, and then you'll eventually share this with them, because I believe this is really what we call the cold, hard facts. And we can ask. The issue of Das Torah came about not that long ago. I've asked many scholars about that. When did you ever hear this term, Das Torah, the true Torah opinion? Because many people will say, Das Torah says you don't need to live in Israel. Das Torah this and that. Or your rabbis, your religious Zionist rabbis are not Das Torah. That also became an argument that allowed people not to have to feel that they needed to come to Israel. And so this is an explanation of what has transpired. So I think also what happened is that once there was this whole movement of being able to be more extreme. I remember someone telling me, we discussed this, that Rabbi Soloveitchik ate Kraft cheese. My friend Rabbi Rakefet told me that he was a very, very close to the Rav, and he ate Kraft cheese. If you ever said this, the Rav ate Kraft, people would say, no way, it's not possible, because today no one eats Kraft cheese. You have Miller's cheese, and you have Migdal, you have all these other brands that are kosher. And so then we're able to be more and more and more strict. And Orthodox Jews made tremendous strides in the United States. And so they had luxuries. Like for something very simple today, when we learned the kashrut laws back in the 70s, it was unheard of for a person to be able to have two ovens. We were never told, we were never learned that in the yeshiva. And we had rabbis that had learned in Slobodka that had come to teach us. And today, the way that kashrut laws are taught is that you must have a dairy oven and you must have a meat oven. Now, that's very nice if you can do it. I'm not saying one shouldn't do that, but that is a luxury, or that is a stringency. And so stringencies and chumrot became the norm for Judaism, and people often didn't know the difference. So that when someone follows kashrut laws today, as opposed to somebody who follows kashrut laws 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we were not taught to keep a kosher home with the same level of stringency. Now, it's nice that people can be stringent, but they need to know the difference between what is the law and what is a stringency. And as a result of this, it ended up that Israel also became very, very became more and more extreme in a good way. It's not bad to keep chumrah. I thought it was very interesting. I saw on a question that one of my daughters had for Pesach, saying, what should you do on Pesach if you go to someone's house and they don't hold by the same stringencies that you hold by? So jokingly, I would tell them that, that you should embarrass them and make them feel that they're much smaller than you. Obviously, that's not the answer. The answer that they taught these girls, this was in Chorev, they taught them that the correct answer was keep your chumras to yourself. These are stringencies. Don't make someone else feel bad if this is only a stringency and it's not necessarily the halacha. Now, why do I mention this? Because one of the real tragedies is that we have today, I don't know if it's 31 flavors, but I did see that once. They made 31 flavors of Judaism. But that was, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist. They had all kinds. But within Orthodoxy, there's all kinds of labels that they have for Orthodox Jews. There's Dati Light, there's Hareidi, there's Hasidish, there's Hardal, Hareidi Leumi. And people are taught that they're supposed to identify themselves as to what they are. I mean, the common denominator should be that what everyone is that everyone follows the Torah. Everybody believes in Torah min Shemayim. Everyone believes in God. Everyone knows that Torah was given on Mount Sinai, and that's the way that we observe it. And everyone should be very careful to observe the entire Torah. Now, in the movement that eventually developed after the Yom Kippur War, the settlement movement, which originated in Merkaz Arav, all right, where I also studied, and I had the honor of blessing the people with Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, right? The Rav Tzvi Yehuda, the son of the first chief rabbi of Israel, and he was the one that went out there and pushed, the settlements all over Israel. And there was this strong wave of people who were very, very strong in their convictions to Torah and to Judaism, and they were and you would not have. I remember going to a wedding of my nephew who studied in Merkaz Arav, and it was the first time I ever saw a wedding in Merkaz Arav where they had separate seating for the dinner for men and women, and that was Merkaz Arav, which was considered a religious Zionist yeshiva. And I thought, wow, they're getting very strict as well. And so, how could it happen that that the group that's known as the Hareidim, who were anti-state and anti-serving in the army, anti-saying the prayer for the state of Israel, why couldn't they get their act together with the Merkaz Arav crowd, or what we call a Hardal, Hareidi Leumi? That's the way these guys are just as intent on learning with a great deal of enthusiasm and hatmada, diligence, and they keep the halacha diligently. They're very strict in everything else, but somehow we're unable to get our act together. I love to tell the story of no rain. One year that I lived in Israel many years ago, it was already December and it hadn't rained. And people started adding the prayer in the Shemona Esrei for rain. And the two groups, the religious Zionist group or Mizrahi, decided to call for a prayer, a special prayer ceremony at the Kotel at 3:00. I believe it was on a Thursday. And by mistake, the Aguda group, the Hareidi group, called for a prayer service at 3:00 at the Kotel. I don't believe they planned it. Okay, but what you had then, because usually when you have these kinds of big prayers, it's either in black and white or in color, right? But this time the Kotel was full of both the religious Zionists and the Haredim, and they're all praying for rain because it hadn't really rained. I was there. Guess what happened? It started raining at this prayer ceremony. So the tragedy of all of this is that we still do not have the Jewish unity that we need. The election today, you have Shas, you have Religious Party, you have Aguda, you have Bennett, who's supposed to be one form of religious Zionist, you have Smotrich, who's another form of religious Zionist. Why do you have all these factions of the religious community? So I think that maybe, it's a bit of a long shot to make such a claim, but I think that what I've said should really warrant itself to hear some of the comments that you might have, because I'm sure that there are many things that I said that you may disagree with. But what I'm hoping is, by pointing out the problem, is that people will join together and that we would realize the koach, the strength of Jewish unity, and that there isn't this factionalizing. And that's probably the job of Mashiach. What the Mashiach is going to have to do is he's going to have to bring all the groups together, and he's going to have to say, that all of you are right, and we have to join. We are one family. We are one people. So maybe the Haredim, for example, are known for their intensity in Torah study. And so the Mashiach is going to say that intensity, that's important. That must stay. The religious, the Chardal or the Gush Eminim, that your passion for the land of Israel, that's so important. That stays. That has to be part of Judaism. We need to learn these things. The idea of the Hasidim, that their meditation, their deep service of Hashem, that's important. And that there's an aspect of the observance of all these different groups that call themselves religious, and also finding a way to join the people who call themselves secular and join them all together, because we are one people. And that is the way that we know from our experience, that when it came to people that wanted to destroy us, they didn't make any distinction of how we define ourselves. Hey, wait a minute, you can't hurt me. I'm a Chardal, or I'm a Gouda. I was against the Medina all these years, so you can't hurt. They didn't care. They didn't care, because a Jew was a Jew, and we need to recognize that this is something which is so important. And I think it's time that people realize that something big is going on. I had a chavruta once with a rabbi who was part of that Hareidi community, and he said to me, I realize something big is going on here. When we have 6.7 million Jews living in the land of Israel, he goes, I know it's not something that is nothing. He says, but why do you have to call it Medina? Or why do you have to call it the Geula? Let's just wait and see, right? And so that was one of the controversies. But at this point, it's foolishness, because we have to look at what we have and appreciate what we have in having a state of Israel, and knowing that we have a great blessing that we should not take for granted. And it's a terrible thing when people say, okay, I support Israel from far away. I don't need to be there. I don't need to be a part of it. I can learn here too. When Hashem opened up the gates for Jews from all over the world, where if we have our eyes open, we're able to count every single day the miracles that are right before our eyes. So much nevuah, so much fulfillment of prophecy right before our eyes. The ingathering of the exile, the intensity of Torah study like never before, not since the Second Temple period. The growth of the land, all the things that we're able to witness. Even today, there were people who would dress up in suits to vote, because they felt they had come from countries where they were living under dictatorships. And how fortunate are we to have a country where people can vote and we live in somewhat of a democracy. And so I hope that what I explained was what went on, and I try to be as objective as possible. I tried to explain how I think that those people who protested the idea of a Jewish state by secular people, I don't know that I wouldn't have protested it myself had I been around at that time. It would have been something of concern. But once it happened and you saw that people were able to come and were able to, what a miracle it is if we went from 7,000 Jews in the year 1800 to 6.7 million in 2021. How could someone not recognize that is not the hand of God and not appreciate what that is, and instead just be completely blind to it? I have to also mention that the pasuk that we read a few weeks ago in Parshat Para was a huge motivator for me. The parsha where it said, Am Hashem Eile Ume'artzo Yatzau, that was the pasuk that motivated me to move to Israel, where the prophet Yechezkel says that the very presence of a Jew outside of Israel is a desecration of the name of God. Why is it a desecration of the name of God? Because God is made to look weak. Because the non-Jew could point to the Jew saying, you are God's chosen people. What are you doing? What are you doing? Your God, why aren't you in his chosen land? And God says, therefore, I had pity on my holy name, and therefore no more desecration. Now I'm going to gather all the Jewish people from the four corners of the earth, and all the miracles that we've witnessed or were prophesied in that chapter 36. So I want to close and close my talk at least, and leave myself open to some comments, which I imagine we're going to have, or corrections perhaps, by understanding and appreciating, as we're about to enter Pesach, and God willing, we're about to leave the plague of Corona. It looks like we're getting out of it, God willing, and appreciate what it is that we have, and mention it at our Seder that we're going to be experiencing Saturday night, and recognize that the state of Israel, having the state of Israel, is a tremendous gift, and it is a sanctification of the name of God. It is a Kiddush Hashem, and if for no other reason than the nations of the world being able to accuse us, as they did for centuries, saying God once loved the Jewish people, but he has abandoned them. And we can now say to them, oh, really? Has God abandoned us? When we've seen a rebirth of the Hebrew language and a rebirth of the people, we're not looking very abandoned anymore. And that's probably the biggest reason why so many people are coming to be part of Am Yisrael, because the state of Israel also proves the truth and the authenticity of the Jewish religion. So I wish everyone a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, and I'll ask our host to open it up for comments or questions, and like to hear if there is some kind of feedback on your part, to share it with us. Anybody?
Yeah, it was nice. I enjoyed it, and maybe you will get some kickback from the GMS crowd. I doubt it. You'd get more kickback from maybe one of the other shuls there. I'm not going to say their name. If anyone wants to yell at you, they can yell at me. I'm used to getting yelled at. I'm sure you're aware of. So it's okay. So anybody got any questions? Go ahead.
Rabbi Cohen, I have a couple of things to say about your analysis. I'm not a sociologist, as you know, but I think that some of the reasons for the switch, there are several reasons. First of all, look at the schools and the day schools in America today. Who's doing the teaching? Who's doing the teaching there? It's usually more Hareidi fellows and women, because the Dati Leumi camp sends them to the professions, to become doctors and lawyers and businessmen and other professions. The teaching of Hebrew today in American day schools is minimal. Kids spend an entire 12 years in day school, come to Israel after high school and can barely speak Hebrew. So that's another thing. Of course, that the Hareidi families tend to have more children than the Dati Leumi families. So that all this together has caused the shift in the populations of these two groups. It doesn't explain why the Hareidi movement is not more supportive of Aliyah. They certainly are supportive of Eretz Yisrael, but not of Medinat Yisrael. And I think it's a great shame.
Right. Okay. The only comment I have about your comment, which is true, is why you're suggesting that the reason why most of the teachers are more of the Hareidi bent is because the more national religious have not chosen that field. I think that at one time those were the teachers. When I even from first grade, I had Israeli teachers that were teaching me. Like I mentioned earlier, they had Bnei Akiva shlichim that were teaching in the schools, and I think part of it is I don't know what came first. Did the shift in philosophy come first, and then that led to the idea that the schools only accepted such people, or that's all that the only ones that were interested in being in that field were people of that background. You hear what I'm saying? I'm saying it depends, like what happened, because the shift definitely took place. Why it took place or how it took place, it's true. It could be a sociological explanation to it also, but the reality is that this is what it is today, and like it's really hard to find schools or teachers that come from the national religious camp anymore, and they sort of took over, like how are you letting a guy teach who's not Das Torah? our school is not, even though they're not, the parents are not of that same background. You know, I can see that. I don't know if Danny Sofers, who's listening, I think, remembers that year, the first year that I would move back to Los Angeles. They didn't want, I was teaching in a day school. They didn't want to play Hatikva at the 8th grade graduation. And so I led a rebellion, right? I'm 25 years old teaching, and I led a rebellion, and I found out who the influential, I was a bit of a troublemaker, I guess, and who were the influential parents that gave money to the school. And one of the daughters was in that class. And then I said, you know, do you realize that they're not going to sing a tikva at your daughter's 8th grade graduation? And he called the principal, and the principal, who became religious through B'nai Akiva, right? Who now was Hareidi. He said, well, I would, but the musician doesn't know that song. That was his answer. And so the fellow said, I'll hire the musician. So so the kids felt that they had a victory. And I'm still in touch with some of them from that year, that they remember that somebody fought for principles, you know. And how is it today? And that's another issue. You sort of touched on it. Is that the year in Israel for many, many students saves them. So there's also this thing, the whole educational system is all questionable. You know, there are some good schools in the States, but there are a lot of them that you wonder, what do they learn for 12 years? Like, how do they come to Israel and they're not on par with an Israeli kid in religious studies, you know? So
Not even close. Not even close.
You know, and part of it, you're right, they should be teaching Ivrit B'Ivrit, that would help a lot. But so what are they teaching? They're teaching you how to be frum?
Oh, another thing that they don't teach is Jewish history, at least not beyond Bayit Sheni.
That's
So,
right.
of course, the modern era in particular is just ignored completely.
Yeah, because you have to choose subjects that are going to inspire students, and Jewish history definitely would, when you talk about Jewish heroes and things of that nature. So that definitely would have an effect. All right, I appreciate those are good comments. I thought that maybe, you know, some of the dates and some of the those things were not necessarily accurate, but it's not that important for what I was trying to get across. I was trying to make a statement, and I believe it's, you know, reasonably well taken. So anybody else have any comments, questions that they would like to add? Okay.
Rabbi Cohen?
Yes.
I had the great pleasure of teaching Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cohen Cook's Sefer. My name is Shmuel Platzker. I'm the chairman emeritus of Gulf Manor Synagogue. And we created a school of Jewish studies at the school. And we began our book club part of that school with Ema Banim Smecha by Rabbi Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, Shem Yikom Damav, a book that I had sitting on my shelf that I had never learned growing up in a somewhat Hareidi school, and spent 2.5 years in Chappelle's after being in yeshiva all my life. Best thing I ever did. And came back and became a lawyer. But long story short, I saw this sefer on the shelf, and I said, I got to teach this. And I was blown away by it. And then we saw Rav Kook's Orot al Eretz Yisrael. And then I decided to get into Rav Tzvi Yehuda's Sefer Torah Eretz Yisrael, which is a tremendous eye-opener. And I began to understand the mentality of frankly, of I guess, the Gush Emunim crowd that I had I knew about. We went to spend a Shabbat here and there, Kiryat Arba, Parshat Chayesara, and so on. And of course, so there's the yeshiva here and there, but I had never really understood, frankly, the passionate love of the land of Israel until I really kind of got inside the mind of Tzvi Yehuda. So I really am so glad that I did that. And when we saw that sefer, we then kind of pivoted into a book called When Mashiach Comes, by Rabbi Yehuda Chayun. And I was amazed to see a Hareidi approach to the redemption, quoting a tremendous amount of Chazalim, Psukim, Midrashim, Gemaras, and so on, and not at all, not even once, and I mean not even once, acknowledging that there is a state of Israel that's been in existence for the past 50 or so years. He wrote the book in the early 90s. And they reminded me of my own yeshiva upbringing in New York City, where the state of Israel was never mentioned once, not through elementary school, not through junior high, not through high school. And basically, I was in college, and it was a little bit of a kind of a crazy time. But during those 12 formative years of grades pre-1a through 12, the Medinat Yisrael, that phrase, those two words, Medinat Yisrael, were never linked together in a those two words we never discussed it. There was no such thing. Not a single rabbi in 12 years ever mentioned that there was a state of Israel. And it was shocking. Only time I actually learned about Israel was when my sister was living there after seminary, and then she came back after some time and spent a little bit of time in Yerushalayim and visiting during my college years. And I was blown away by Yerushalayim. I just could not believe what I was seeing. And so after graduation, I went to Chappelle's and I spent 2.5 years in the Holy City, and I'm so grateful that I did that. So why am I not there?
Isn't that sad, though? Isn't that sad? Here you're a guy that loves learning, and you were never exposed to this stuff. It's pretty sad. Pretty sad.
Right, and it's very, and I don't think I'm the only one who is unexposed to the reality of what is Israel out there on the in the world stage. It's just amazing. Just a little point as far as one point about why there are no Mizrahi Dati Leumi Chardal Mechanchim in the day schools in America. I think that's because, frankly, I think it's because Israel successfully as a state, Israel attracted so many of that the best and brightest of the Mizrahi movement that they moved to Israel. And there, you want to see Mechanchim, they're in the land of Israel. They're in Medina Israel. They're not in America anymore. To a great extent, they're not in America anymore. So who is left? You do find a mull here and there, a young guy who wants to get into chinuch. But the professions do, of course, they do attract.
Yeah, that's also a theory. But here's your guy loves learning, and you had to just stumble on a book to get to it. It's pretty sad. But hopefully this will maybe wake people up a little bit, and the ultimate goal is to bring about some kind of Jewish unity. Moshe Weinberg has an interesting comment there about the fellow is a bit controversially, shouldn't be, Rav Natan Slifkin, rationalism versus mysticism. So he tries to explain it as well, the reason for the divide. But it's hard to be objective. I think that's also part of the problem of this whole thing, is being able not to be too biased and to try to be open-minded. I'd like to think, everybody's good, everybody has something, good to say, and we just have to try to find some common denominator. If we made mistakes, then we should recognize it, that we should see it that way. But certain things definitely are off. That the lack of acknowledgement of the gift of Eretz Yisrael is a huge that's a huge problem. That and it's every year when we get to Parsha of Shlach about the Meraglim, you wonder, who are they today? Who are the Meraglim who are bad-mouthing Israel? Bad-mouthing Israel is a terrible thing. Okay, you don't want to come, you don't want to bad-mouth Israel? Hashem gives us such a precious gift, that's really inexcusable. All right, I think our time is, we used an hour, just about. So I think we will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Chag Sameach.
Yeah, Chag Sameach, Chag Pesach Sameach, Chag Kasher Sameach. All right, anything else?
Rabbi, I enjoyed it tremendously.
All right, thank you. Okay. All right, Achihud, we're signing off.
Yeah, it was really nice, Rabbi. Thank you. And I appreciate that you were humble enough at times when you said that this was your opinion. A lot of rabbis are so arrogant that they cannot distinguish between a hardcore fact and their own opinion. So I think that brought a lot of value to your share, and I appreciate it a lot.
All right, you'll send everyone the link, and maybe they'll share it with their friends when it gets on YouTube. All right.
Thank you very much.
Signing off. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.